So our first speaker of today is going to be Christine O'Reilly. She's going to be speaking on Winterkill Woes, What We Can Learn from 2019. And Christine's background, Christine O'Reilly is our Omafra Forage and Grazier Specialist. Christine O'Reilly is the Forage and Grazing Specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Her areas of focus include the benefits of forages and grazing within cropping systems, forage production and grazing systems for Northern Ontario, and improving the productivity and profitability of forages. Christine joined the ministry in 2017 and is based out of the Lindsay office. Please welcome Christine.
Thanks, Terry. Good morning, everybody. So my talk today, Winterkill Woes, what we can learn from 2019. It was a tough one, but while it has definitely been described as an anomaly, there are things that we can take away that will be useful. So the first obvious question is, what happened? So in January, and you can see the calendar I've put up here, is indicating the daily high temperature throughout that month. So dates that have a white square, the daily high temperature was 0. If it is pink, it was between 0 and +5. If it is red, it's between +5 and +10. Likewise, if it was between 0 and -5, it's that light purple. And if it was between -5 and -10, the daily high temperature is in dark blue. So you can see that we had a lot of days in January where the temperatures were, at least the daily high was above 0. It happened again in February. We had some thawing events. And it happened again in March. It happened a lot in March. Now this is the data out of Oshawa, so it isn't necessarily accurate day to day for the whole province, but we did see those freeze-thaw cycles in most of southwestern, central, and eastern Ontario throughout the winter. So we lost that snow cover. We had some ice sheeting. We had water pooling in low areas, and all of these factors contributed to the higher than average levels of winterkill that we saw last year. So that's what happened. We got through it this year, but the things that we can take away from this are how can we be proactive so that the kind of pressure that we saw as a result of that winter injury isn't going to be quite as panic situation as it may have felt some of those days. So the first thing that we can look at is really getting out into those fields early and doing an alfalfa assessment. So the plant count method, where you go out into your field and you count how many healthy plants per square foot you have in several locations throughout a field, it's a great early warning system. So the number of plants that you need in that stand depends on the age of the stand, because as alfalfa plants age, the stand thins itself, but the plants each get bigger. So the number of healthy plants per square foot you need does vary depending on how old that plant is. The reason I call a plant count your early warning system is because you're trying to assess how many healthy plants you have, and if you're below the thresholds listed on this slide, it's a great chance to take action early. Figure out, what are you going to do? Is it bad enough you need to terminate the stand? Can you get away with patching it to get through this year? And then make the appropriate calls to input suppliers to get the seed and possibly the fertility that you need to make that plant happen. It's a great warning sign so that you know you've got to get that planter ready to go early so that you can hit the ground running to react if your early warning system, your plant count, once the snow is gone and things start to green up, if at that point you know there's a problem, you've got a lot of time to figure out how you're going to get all those pieces in place. While you're doing that plant count and that assessment of health, these are the sorts of things that you should be looking for. So this is an assessment that's being done at green up. So you're looking to see how green and robust those new leaves and buds really are. Do they look healthy? It's great to go out there with not only a spade to dig up some plants, but also a jackknife so you can cut open some of those taproots and really see what color are they. So a healthy alfalfa taproot should look like the inside of a potato. It's kind of a tuber off-white sort of color. If it's yellow or brown, if it's really ropey and stringy, that root is not healthy. That plant might not make it. So don't include those kinds of weak, unhealthy plants in your count per square foot because they're probably not going to make it. Looking for lateral roots to see if lateral roots are fairly well developed, and that can be a bit of a challenge because often when you're digging them up, they're the small roots that get cut. But something to look for, looking at nodulation in an established stand, and also seeing how well the bark on that taproot resists peeling. So if it's very easy to flake it off, that taproot's not very healthy. But if it's harder to get the bark away from the root itself, that's a good sign that that plant is relatively healthy and fairly vigorous. So the next assessment for your field comes a little bit later. The plant count, where you're looking at just numbers per square foot, that's your early warning system. That happens at green up. The next assessment is your stem count. This one happens when the stems on those plants are about 6 inches or 15 centimeters tall. So at this point, what you're really looking at is your yield potential. So the difference here is that your stem count has been shown from research out of Wisconsin that this is a much more accurate predictor of yield than the number of plants alone. So with your stem count, because of the increasing size of crown as those alfalfa plants age, those crowns are going to send up more stems per plant in an older field. So this is where you're just counting stems and your plant numbers are not a part of this particular assessment. So we know from research that if you have 55 or more stems per square foot, your yield potential is 100%. Now we all know that weather conditions, pests, diseases, those kinds of things can impact your yield throughout the growing season, but this is your yield potential right out of the gate for that production year. If the yield if the stems per square foot are between 40 and 50, then you've lost some yield potential, but in most cases, it's still worth keeping the stand for that year. You may want to consider patching it depending on what your feed inventories look like and how things are progressing in the whole farm. But generally, once that number of stems per square foot count, once you're below 40 stems per square foot, it's generally not worth keeping that stand because the yield potential is already less than 75%. So if a quarter of the feed you thought you're going to put up isn't going to happen before weather gets to it, before insects, diseases get to it, then at that point it's often worth terminating that stand. So I mentioned that this talk was going to focus on things we learned from last winter and things that we can control, because focusing on the aspects of forage production that we can control is a lot more productive than only worrying about the weather and other factors that we cannot control. So the first factor that is in your hands as a producer is selecting disease-resistant varieties. Disease management in forages, this is the cornerstone, really. So alfalfa varieties are assessed for their resistance to diseases. Sometimes that disease-resistant index is out of a score of 30, and it is basically testing the first 6 diseases on this list. So if a perfect score is 30, it has very high resistance to all 6 of those diseases. Aphanomyces root rot race 2 has been identified, and breeders have found strains that do show some resistance to that strain of Aphanomyces root rot as well. So some varieties will have a DRI index out of 35. So talk with your seed dealer to determine whether race 2 is included in their assessments, just to understand whether a highly resistant score across the board would result in a total of 30 or 35, depending on how that variety was assessed. But by selecting a disease-resistant variety, you're basically reducing one source of stress that would affect yield potential during the life of that stand. The second risk factor that you can control is fertility. So please fertilize the crop. 2 recommendations. Take a current soil test for that field and develop a fertility plan that will make sure that that crop is getting the fertility it needs. It sounds like crop production 101, and it is crop production 101, but we know that other crops get fertilized to yield to their potential. Often our forage fields don't get that same kind of attention, but it is really important. And specifically in the case of alfalfa, potassium is particularly important for winter hardiness. So ensuring that there's adequate potassium for alfalfa will really help improve its ability to overwinter if it's given the chance from the weather. The next point that producers can have some control over is respecting that fall rest period. So we know that alfalfa needs time in the fall to build up its root reserves, which is the energy stores it's going to use to regrow in the spring. And so the fall rest period is the 6 weeks before the average date of the first killing frost. Now, when feed inventories are low, it's definitely tempting to cut during the fall rest period. But a way around that is if you can wait until after that period is closed. So after that first killing frost, those plants are not going to try to regrow. So you're leaving their energy stores in the ground ready to fuel that spring regrowth, and you're still getting that cut of hay. If that doesn't work, the most risky time to cut, the most stressful time on those plants to cut is during the very middle of that period. So 3 weeks after the date listed on the map for your area, that's the highest risk time to cut an alfalfa field. So very, very early, so really close to that date, or more than 6 weeks after that date, you've reduced the risk and are giving those alfalfa plants the best chance you can to overwinter well. Scouting to stay ahead of problems is something else growers can do. This year in Ontario, we had some insect issues with our alfalfa. Can anyone tell me what kind of insect caused that in the photo? Potato leafhopper, absolutely. So that is the classic sign of potato leafhopper damage. You're seeing yellowing V-shapes from the tips of those alfalfa leaves. That was taken from some plots I had at the Winchester Research Station in the middle of July, and we found potato leafhopper 30 times over threshold. So scouting your field to stay ahead of these problems is really important, because with proactive management, we can reduce the damage that insects and diseases do to our forage crops. With that level of leafhopper pressure, those plants, by the time we see those symptoms, those plants have already stunted. You're not going to get any more yield off that cut. The solution is to mow it. If there's enough there, you can take it as feed. If not, you're going to have to leave it. But then there's a chance to A, take away the feed source to knock back that population, and B, get that crown sending up new shoots for some regrowth to get some yield for the next cut. But scouting would have meant that I would have known that there was potato leafhopper on my plots, and we probably could have done something about it a few weeks earlier. So knowing that while alfalfa is a staple on many of operations in Ontario, it doesn't grow well everywhere, and winter kill can affect some of our other forage crops. So one example of that is bird's foot trefoil. Bird's foot trefoil also has a fall rest period, and we know that it typically starts 10 days earlier than the fall rest period for alfalfa. So this is a legume that if it is grazed or cut during that window in the fall, then it can have issues with winter kill as well. And on the grass side, orchard grass is another one that can be quite sensitive to winter conditions. Historically, about 1 year in 4, we might have some winter injury to orchard grass. Some of that is dependent on whether it has adequate drainage. It's not a grass that likes wet feet, but with the big tufts at the bottom, it can smother as well. So management to help orchard grass persist, although winter hardiness is something that breeders have been selecting for with that crop. So my take-home message, while there are lots and lots of things that growers can do to help strengthen their forage crops and minimize the risks of winter kill, the big one, scout early, scout often. Green up for those plant counts, about 6 inches of growth for those stem counts, and then throughout the growing season to stay on top of any disease and insect pressure. That will put you in a good stead to be proactive about what's happening in your field and protect the yield that we need to feed our livestock. Thank you. So, it's probably on.
If there are any questions from the audience or the remote locations, please feel free to ask them to Christine here. That's some very informative information about the winter kill, and she's happy to answer those. We've got a few minutes here.
My question is about cut height or stubble height. Mm-hmm. Is there any correlation or effect between what a producer chooses to cut his forages or his grasses at and winter kill? Is there anything there?
Yeah, so we know that cutting is a stress on the plant. So stress a single stressor is not necessarily a bad thing, but when we're combining lots of stressors one on top of the other, that's when we start seeing some of those management issues with winterkill. So when it comes to cut height, most of our cool season grasses, their growth point, it's low down on the stem, but it is on the stem. So ideally we want to leave about 3 inches or 7.5 centimeters behind to protect those grasses. Because alfalfa is regrowing from a crown and it's using energy reserves in its taproot, it can handle being cut a little lower. So you could go as low as 2 inches with alfalfa, but if it's an alfalfa grass mix and you want to keep the grasses in there, cut height shouldn't be any tighter than 3. If we were looking at a warm season grass, so something like sorghum sudan grass or switchgrass, they're even more sensitive to low cutting height, so we're looking at a minimum cut height of 4 inches or 10 centimeters for those species.
I just wondered on your stem count, if it's a mixed stem, you cited alfalfa, if it's grass and alfalfa or other crops, is there any way, I don't know if that's a trick question or not, but can you count the grass in your stem count kind of thing, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it's not a trick question, it's a excellent question. So the stem counts were developed on pure alfalfa stands, so they don't give us that indication of what the yield potential of a mixed stand would be. I know that's not the answer exactly you wanted to hear, but yeah, they were developed for a pure stand. So I guess that comes down to a judgment call as well. Are you going to, if your stem count is low in a mixed stand, are you willing to fertilize with some more nitrogen to help those grasses along? Are there enough grasses in there that you feel you can make up the yield loss if you're getting lower on the stem count front with the alfalfa? Yeah.
Any other questions? Christine?
Lindsay is typing.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
I think we've got one in the room, and then we'll take the one from the Lindsay location.
Thank you.
Okay.
Could you go back to your slide about the bird's foot trefoil?
Absolutely.
There. So the rest period starts 10 days earlier than alfalfa, so we really shouldn't be grazing in August, late August.
Well,
for some
it
areas.
depends where you're on the province,
Yeah,
but I
yes,
know
that's
in
true.
your location, yes. So it needs that rest. Once you get through that 6 weeks, it's cold enough, the plant knows it's winter, it's going dormant, it's not going to try to regrow. So there is that opportunity to come back late in the fall without causing that damage, because the trefoil is not going to try to regrow that late. It's going to wait till spring, and whatever energy reserves it's got, it's going to hold on to that, instead of spending them on regrowth in the fall when it doesn't have time to refuel again, if that makes sense. So yeah, it can be quite stressful on birds with trefoil to have a early fall grazing. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so a question from someone back at your home office in Lindsay. And the question is there any benefit to spraying for potato leaf hopper?
So the best management practice for potato leaf hopper, first of all, the threshold for management varies depending on how tall the alfalfa plants are. So I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but we do have resources available that tell you how many adults or nymphs per plant, depending on how tall the plants are. From there, the first recommendation is mow it. If you cut that alfalfa, you are doing 2 things. You're taking away the leafhopper's feed source, and the second thing you're doing is by taking away those stems, you're encouraging the alfalfa crowns to send up new stems. So you've knocked back the population with no food, you've started regrowth again, because when leafhoppers feed on an alfalfa plant, there's a compound in their insects, so it's not exactly saliva, but basically there's a compound in their spit that acts like a plant hormone and blocks off all the plumbing in that plant. So that's what stunts the growth. So by cutting, you're giving a chance to get new stems up that haven't been stunted to keep that crop growing. So that's why mowing is the first line of action. But 5 to 7 days after you cut, the advice is to go back in and scout that field again. If the leafhopper populations are still above threshold, then spraying might be warranted. So it does involve scouting both before to determine that you have a problem, and then afterwards to keep an eye on the situation, because if the population is still too high, then a spray might be the way to go. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And there's a, going to head up to Verner now. There's a question from someone up there. If we are reseeding alfalfa in winterkill patches, which reseeding method would you recommend?
So alfalfa is autotoxic. So what that means is it produces a compound that prevents new alfalfa plants from germinating, or if they do germinate, they have really stunted root systems. So seeding alfalfa onto an existing alfalfa stand generally does not work very well, which is why it's not recommended. So if you have alfalfa winterkill and you need to patch that stand, it's better to go in with a grass. If the plan is to keep that field for 1 year, Italian ryegrass can be a good option, provided it's not going for dry hay, because it's a really tough grass to dry down, but it's very aggressive that 1 year of growth. Otherwise, if you're thinking that it might pull through for longer than that, or depending on the price point, then a perennial grass could be overseeded into that stand. So yeah, but alfalfa is generally not very successful to overseed an established alfalfa stand.
While you head out there, I got another one. We're going to head out to Ridgetown now.
Okay.
How many warm days in winter brings forage out of dormancy?
It does depend a bit on the species. And that is a number I do not have off the top of my head. So I'm sorry, Ridgetown. I don't know that one, but what I can do is make a note and email Dr. Loomis and give you an answer that way. Okay.
Thank you.
Any correlation between winterkill and wheel traffic and compaction?
I think there has been some work done on that, and there can be. The percentage of yield potential that we lose for that, I don't know. But in general, we do see more stress in compacted areas of fields, and that results in a yield hit. And because it is a stressor, it could influence winterkill as well.
Any further questions for Christine?
Mowing. Makes it different what kind of mower you use, of a disc mower, of an old sickle mower, or a new sickle mower, whatever.
Sorry, was the question, does the type of mower make a difference? I haven't seen any work on that. So I can't give you an answer on that one. I haven't seen any work that the type of mower makes a difference as far as winterkill is concerned.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Have